I've been using this jointer for 10 years now, but when I built it, I wasn't even sure if it would work. The cutter head, bearings, pulley, motor, power cable, and switcher from my first generation Delta Lunchbox planer, but I had to buy a longer belt. What I don't have here is a rabbiting ledge because the pulley and the bearing are bigger than the cutter head and they need to be on this side. But mostly I used a rabbiting ledge when the pieces were too wide for a jointer, but with a 12-inch jointer, that's almost never the case. It's been a long time since I made sure that it still cuts straight, so let's check that. Got them clamped together here, touching in the middle, but I've got a gap right here. So it cuts an edge that is slightly convex, which means if I wanted to laminate those two boards together, it requires a bit of clamping force here, about this much. The gap here is about 1 millimeter. I might as well fix that, and that means the jointer is cutting 0.5 millimeter off on that length, which means I should drop the outfeed table by about 0.5 millimeter here, and that works out to 1/3 of a turn on those nuts. But if I put this long ruler on the table, it's hard to tell that the tables are out of parallel. It's all a matter of tweaking things too much. And the problem with using this long 4-foot aluminum ruler is not that the ruler is not straight, but it's gravity. So you can see I've got a gap here because the infeed table is down a bit. But if I just push down on here lightly, it touches the table. Basically, the weight of the ruler already causes a bit of deflection in the ruler, which is getting to be on the order of magnitude of the change I'm trying to make. Looking at the ruler, I'm not so sure I should adjust it at all now. It's also a matter of technique and how you use it. Got those two boards clamped together now, and now there's a slight gap in the middle, not the ends. And once again, that takes a little bit of clamping force to overcome. About this much. What doesn't help is that the tables aren't completely flat. The outfeed table is pretty good, but the infeed table sags in the middle by possibly as much as 0.5 millimeter. I can press the ruler down into it. Well, I think a piece of cardstock under the table right about here would fix most of it. Oh, I think there's the problem. Sawdust got underneath here, so maybe I don't need that shim after all. How these chips got there, I have no idea. Well, that's as flat as I can check it. When I was originally obsessing over that jointer and about how flat the tables were, I checked my cast iron jointer and it turned out those tables weren't any flatter either. In comparison to my table saw, let's put the ruler on here and you can see there's a gap right around here, so almost as much distortion as my jointer. And if you have a cast iron jointer, don't check it. You'll just never be happy with it again. There's a spring down here that forces this guard closed, and that unfortunately wants to undo the screw here, so I have to tighten it real good. This is as far down as the infeed table will go, but the jointer's not strong enough to really take off much more than that anyways. Certainly not across a width like that. Now, when I built it, I had some paranoid fears, like what if it were to throw a knife? Which is why I put the guard on here, and also the fence, of course, would prevent the knife from coming out. The other fear I had is that somehow this head would catch on to the infeed table, and then just from sheer momentum, it would rip the head loose, and would come jumping out into my face. Although that was a little bit irrational, because to do that, it would also have to get through the fence, push these tables way out of the way, and also pull away from this belt, which would prevent it from jumping up. Really, it wouldn't have enough energy to do that. But for part of my paranoia, I made sure that this gap was substantially smaller than the cutter head is large. so that if it were to come loose, it wouldn't be able to come out of this slot, not without pushing a lot of stuff out of the way, and that would use up all the inertia that it would have. And with this only being a 2-inch diameter lunchbox planer cutter head, for a 12-inch jointer, it has a remarkably small gap here, about 3 centimeters or 1.25 inches. And that's good in terms of avoiding tear out, also good if you want to cut some really small pieces. This would be even more unsafe on a regular 12-inch jointer, even most 6-inch jointers. When the jointer starts up, this belt likes to flop around a bit, but it just takes a little bit to stabilize it. So I ended up adding this piece of smooth hardwood inside the guard here, which is fairly close to the belt. So it hits that initially and that stabilizes it. And you can see there isn't too much rubbing here, so that's all it takes. I just noticed the motor shaft here is not entirely parallel to the belt. And this pin has moved forward a bit. I wonder if it's become disengaged in the back. So I haven't actually looked in here in 10 years. Huh, I guess I left some spare shims in here when I built it. Looks pretty clean inside though. So what I thought might have happened is that this pin that holds the motor would have slipped out of that hole and moved this way, but it doesn't look like it's ever come out of that hole, so I think that was out of alignment all along. I reached in there with a stubby screwdriver and backed out those screws so I could move this part. And if you're wondering what this block is for, that's a strain relief for the power cord. I can get in there with a drill. Excellent. Not so much the back one. Now that lines up. And it looks like that tiny bit of extra belt tension from that fixed the flapping issue. I guess that alignment's been wrong all these years. I made the stand like this so that'd be a big place to have a bin here for the chips to fall into, but eventually I decided that I really should add dust collection to this thing. With the space around the cutter head fairly tight and fairly thick infeed and outfeed tables, what happens is sometimes the chips kind of get fed back around and they get thrown out here. That's with the dust collection turned off. Still happens with dust collection, but a lot less because there is air flowing down through here and into the dust bin. Those chips coming back up can also affect the quality of the cut. If you look on this here, you can see it's a little bit scuffed in a few places because this cut I made without dust collection, whereas this cut on the other side doesn't have these little scuff things. And those scuff marks happen if a chip just happens to be on top of the knife when it comes past, so instead of cutting, the chip just scuffs. Dust collection consists of a home air duct fitting and elbow, and then a 4-inch dust collection hose going to this thing here, which is a dedicated dust collector, and it's actually plugged into the jointer. This provides power from the jointer when the switch is turned on, and that powers this thing here, which is a blower I built at some point, and a box dust collection, and a box dust collector that I originally actually built for this table saw. And this blower doesn't actually suck all that hard, but it only has to suck the dust through this length of hose, so it's quite adequate. I really like how the infeed adjust works on here. It's just this crank here, and it turns really easy. And I don't need to lock it or anything like that, so I just reach down there and give it a couple of turns sometimes if I need more or less cut. It takes quite a few turns to adjust it all the way down and up. And I think it's been a decade since I had a look in here, so I'll open it up just for the heck of it. A little bit dusty in here. All this space here is just for the parallelogram adjustment. There's also the wiring here for the switch. The threaded rod for the crank goes in this block, and that pulls the thing on the bottom here back and forth, and that in turn adjusts the parallelogram mechanism. And what I like about the parallelogram mechanism, it supports the infeed table, but it also holds it down so that if I get an extra bit of downforce here, it's not going to lift here. And also, even if I lift the jointer like this, I can lift the jointer by the table and it's not a problem. Now I had been thinking earlier, I thought that table went down a little bit further than it did, and I just noticed there's a whole lot of sawdust back there. This stuff. And that has leaked out from between the table and this guard here. So I'll vacuum that out and then I'll have a little bit more adjustment again. That does go down a little bit further than it used to now. And the reason I get dust in there is, of course, all the dust gets thrown this way, and there's a slight gap between the infeed table and my dust deflector thingy here. In fact, this is the dust deflection thingy, and that has a slight gap with the table here, because when the table's all the way down, it touches, and when I move that table up, a slight gap opens there. Before adding this dust collection thing here, I actually had a gap here where the sawdust could fall out, which I blocked with it, and that's why it ended up accumulating. This is where the cutter head is and the main sawdust falls out. I'm going to screw this thing to the bottom edge of the table. Okay, I just installed this part, and then I had the idea of making this part here move so there's never a gap. Well, this update ended up more interesting than I thought it would be. But if I was building again, what would I change? I would make the table longer, but when I built it in the shop I didn't have that much space. The caster wheels sort of made sense in my last two shops because I kept shuffling the machines around. But here I really don't move it, and they're just kind of annoying because the jointer has a tendency to move on me, which is why I propped this box under the stand here. So just now I made these brackets to keep that jointer from rolling around anymore. And I can still drag it around the floor to move it because it's not that heavy. And lastly, I would probably use an induction motor instead of the motor that came with the planer, because that motor is just so loud. So I want to try changing it over to this crazy big motor, and that'll be an upcoming video. And I almost forgot to mention, I have a set of plans available for this jointer on my website. Lots of people have used that set of plans to build their own 12-inch jointer.